So we are very pleased to welcome you all to the first session of the 2021 webinar series on Sephardic thought and modernity, co-sponsored by the Calgary Institute for the Humanities, King's College London, the International Network for Jewish Thought of Complutense University of Madrid, Center Sephardi Israel of Madrid, and the American Sephardi Federation, and organized and coordinated by Dr. Yuval Ivri and myself, Angie Cohen. We are excited and moved by the enthusiastic response to this initiative and the large number of people who are joining us today. This only shows there is a need we all feel to coordinate the work conducted by so many scholars in so many different countries on the question of Jewish modernities, which were not exclusively mediated by Europeanization, but rather had other influences, were involved in different dialogues, and were part of many different worlds. The various Sephardi experiences of modernity show us different pasts and invite us to also imagine a different future. Our initial thought was that this series would be the beginning of a bigger project that would include a longer series with many other researchers and also the creation of a network and a research team. We will keep you all posted about our progress in this regard, but we are already very lucky to have such a rich list of potential partners and participants. This webinar series is a transdisciplinary and transatlantic initiative, both in terms of the organizations that have partnered with us and the exceptional panelists that have agreed to join us in making this series possible. We want to say thank you to Almog Behar, Yaakov Yadgar, Clemens Buluk, and Gabriela Bensur for their participation in this series. Also, we are grateful for the collaborating institutions, Calgary Institute for the Humanities, King's College London, Center Sephardi Israel of Madrid, the American Sephardi Federation, and finally the International Network for Jewish Thought of Complutense University of Madrid, coordinated by Roberto Navarrete, who kindly invited us to bring our voice and perspective to this forum. There are multiple disciplines represented here: history, sociology, literature, philosophy, multiple languages, Arabic, Hebrew, Judeo-Arabic, French, English, Italian, Spanish, and multiple geographical locations. This could not be more adequate for a series devoted to Sephardi experiences of modernity. This multiplicity of belongings, languages, cultures, and genres, and systems of thought is one of the critical elements of these historical experiences that we attempt to begin to explore here with you all. I will now introduce the series and say a few words in Spanish to those following us from Spain. Bienvenidos a la primera sesión del webinar 2021 sobre pensamiento sefaradí y modernidad, patrocinado por el Instituto de Humanidades de la Universidad de Calgary, el King's College London, el Centro Sephardi Israel de Madrid, la Asociación Sefaradí Americana y la Red Internacional de Pensamiento Judío de la Universidad Complutense de Madrid, coordinada por Roberto Navarrete, quien tan amablemente como siempre nos invitó a traer nuestra voz y nuestra mirada a este espacio. Yuval Ivri y yo, Angie Cohen, como coordinadores de la serie, os damos la bienvenida y os agradecemos vuestra presencia y apoyo. Estamos conmovidos por el entusiasmo con el que se ha acogido esta iniciativa. Esto es solo muestra de la necesidad de coordinar el trabajo de numerosos investigadores en diferentes países que se ocupan de la cuestión de las modernidades judías que no fueron exclusivamente mediadas por la europeización. Las diferentes experiencias sefaradíes nos muestran modernidades judías plurales, con diversas influencias, partícipes de diferentes diálogos y vinculadas a distintos mundos. Las experiencias sefaradíes de la modernidad nos muestran otros pasados judíos que nos invitan también a pensar en otros futuros posibles. So Yuval is going now to introduce our speaker, Almog Behar.
Thank you very much, Angie, and I'm really excited about this event, and thank you for Angie for initiating it and pushing it, and it was great working together about it. And I think it's part of what you said about this transnational and multilingual project that is really important for us to focus on Sephardi modern life and experience from this angle. And maybe before I'm presenting Almog, and I think part of saying some words, few words about this series and about maybe the larger project that we're working on, and continue what you said, Angie, I think that it's not surprising that boundaries become such a crucial issue in the research into modern Sephardic cultural life. The research fields boundary lines in terms of language, temporality, space, and place are far from being clear today. What are, for instance, is the linguistic scope? Is it literary Arabic, Hebrew, Judeo-Arabic, Ladino, Spanish, French, or English? Is it a division of a larger Jewish history or literary field, or should it be considered as part of Hebrew, Arabic, Middle Eastern, Spanish, or post-colonial literary frameworks? Can we explore and understand the Sephardi intellectual world through the existing fragmented academic, disciplinary, and terminology? Can we transcend geographical, historical, disciplinary boundaries and reorganize and reconnect the fragmented pieces within a cross-disciplinary framework? Moreover, and this is something that me and Angie was thinking about, which term should we use to define the collective entity or identity which lies in the center of this research field? Sephardi Jews, Arab Jews, Mizrahim, Ottoman Jews, or maybe Middle Eastern Jews? What kind of historical, lingual, geographical, and political sets of issues are encoded in each term? No single name or term seems to be fully represent a unified entity. The terms used here, Sephardic Jews, Arab Jews, Mizrahim, overlap and are slippery. They also refer to internally diverse groups and carry different epistemological and historical and disciplinary baggage. Thus, it is hardly surprising, and we decided in our series to use Sephardi Jews, but we know that our discussion is going to cover the other terms and names, and we're going to cross over them. So it's hardly surprising that the story of the Sephardi modernization in the scholarly literature is frequently associated with the language conversion, understood as one-way linguistic transition from Judeo-Arabic to literary Arabic, from Judeo-Spanish to Turkish, Spanish or French, and from Arabic to English or French, from Arabic to English or French, and most dramatically from Arabic to Hebrew, and maybe it will be one of the centers of our first talk today. This narrative of transition or transitions is usually depicted as part of a dramatic shift between opposing cultural worlds, from religious, traditional to secular modern, from Eastern culture to Western culture, and from an Islamic setting to a Jewish setting. Thus, the linguistic shift signifies a broader political and social transformation, national, imperial, religious, geographical, or ideological, intertwined with the demise of an old and the emergence of a new cultural order. Those religious, linguistic, and cultural divisions capture the narrow and fragmented parts of the story. They overlook the polyglot, multicultural, and transnational settings in which this process took place. So one of the organizing themes during our series this year will be the linguistic aspect. In the Sephardi Modern Project, it will be dealt either in really talking about this linguistic conversion or about different linguistic traditions. Is it religious or traditional or modern, and so on and so forth. So this is one of the themes that we're gonna talk about. So we are really happy that we have Almog Behar with us to deliver the opening lecture. And Almog, in his work as a researcher, as a writer, as a translator, explores the movement between Hebrew and Arabic and focuses on bilingualism and translation in the writing of Arabic-speaking Jewish world. In his lecture today, titled Between Judeo-Arabic, Literary Arabic, and Hebrew in Jewish Arabic Literary Modernity, Almog will speak about the search of an Arab-Jewish modern literary from an Arab-Jewish literary modernity. Almog Behar is a poet, novelist, translator, editor, and critic. Behar was born at 1978, and he now lives in Jerusalem. He published 5 books, the latest being Shirim Le'asirei Bate HaSohar, Poems for the Prisoners, published in 2016. His novel, Chachla Vecheskel, Rachel and Cheskel, was published in 2010 and was translated into Arabic and published in Cairo. Behar is one of the founders of the Judeo-Arabic Cultural Studies program in Tel-Aviv University and a lecturer in literature department in Tel-Aviv University. His PhD work was on he wrote it in the Department of Literature in Tel Aviv University on the subject for modern Jewish liturgical poetry to the Mizrahi literature in the 20th century towards the genealogy of Mizrahi literature in Israel. And I hope, inshallah, it's going to be published as a book soon. Almog wrote much more articles and prose and his literature work, his prose and poetry was translated to different languages, not only into Arabic. But we'll stop here, and then he's a good friend and colleague of both me and Angie, and we were so happy that he's the first speaker tonight. So the floor is yours. Almog is going to speak for 45 minutes, and then we're going to open for discussion and questions. So if you have a question that you want to raise, please feel free to write it in the chat, and we're going to give you the opportunity to do it, or you want just to write the question, we will present it to Almog. It's also possible. So Almog, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, at least here in Jerusalem. And thank you, Angie and Yuval, for the introduction and for the initiative for this series on Sephardi thought and modernity. And I'm looking forward for this continuing discussion on the next meetings. And as you could see from the title to my talk today, between Judeo-Arabic, literary Arabic, and Hebrew in Jewish Arab literary modernity, the question I'm interested in is connected to the relationship between the different languages that were part of the Jewish communities in the Arab world, or phrased differently, the Arab-speaking Jewish communities, between them Judeo-Arabic, Rabbinical Hebrew as the traditional languages, and the new national languages, literary Arabic or modern standard Arabic, and modern Hebrew or Israeli Hebrew, and also the colonial languages, French, English, and to a lesser degree, Spanish and Italian. I'm interested in how the changing relationships and interfaces between those languages changed in the last 200 years and how it was connected to modernity and to literary modernity. Maybe I will open from a larger historical perspective about the negotiations between Arabic and Hebrew in the Arab-speaking Jewish world. And then I will go into the last 200 years and how they were connected in complex ways to the question of modernity, nationalism, and colonialism. And of course, at the same time, to tradition, religion, and secularism. And then I will go on into few examples as much as time will allow us. Probably Avraham Shalom Yehuda, Ariel Ben Zion, but we will see how time limits us or what it allows us. So going back 1,000 years, the movement between Hebrew and Arabic stood for many generations at the center of Jewish literature and expressed literary tendencies, perceptions of identity, and sometimes also theological influences. One starting point for this relationship within Judaism is the extensive literary project of Rabbi Sa'adia Gaon in the 10th century and the poetic enterprise of Dunash Ben Labrat. The movement from Hebrew into Arabic and vice versa underwent great changes over the centuries, yet continuously remains central to all Jewish communities in the Arab world through secular and religious works in Judeo-Arabic and translations between languages, from the philosophical works of Rabbi Judah Halevi and Maimonides, through translators as Rabbi Judah Alharizi and the Ibn Tibbon family to the last centuries. Thus, we can note that Rabbi Israel Najara in 16th century Sephardi wrote piyut, liturgical poetry, under the influence of Arab Muslim Sufi poetry. Many of Rabbi Shalom Shabazi's piyutim in 17th century Yemen were written in Judeo-Arabic under the influence of the Khomeini Arab Muslim poetry. Rabbi Yosef Haim in 19th century Baghdad wrote his book of halakha for women, Qanun Al-Nisaa, the law of women, in Judeo-Arabic, along with many of his piyutim. And Rabbi David Buzaglo in 20th century Morocco and in Israel wrote a large portion of his piyutim, both in Hebrew and in Judeo-Arabic, many of them in a matruz genre, woven or intertwined poems that are bilingual, among so many others. In the last 200 years, the questions of language and modernity in the Arab-speaking Jewish communities became very complex and underwent many changes that were central to Jewish writers in those communities, whether they wrote in Judeo-Arabic, in Rabbinical Hebrew, in literary Arabic, or colonial languages, and when they wrote and evidently lived in more than one language through bilingualism and translation. In moving between those languages, they were in search for an Arab Jewish modern literary form, an Arab Jewish literary modernity. Since the mid-19th century, Arabic-Hebrew relations in the Middle East and North Africa were influenced by a host of factors: the rise of colonialism and a penetration of European languages, mainly French and English, the reform process in the Ottoman Empire, the Tanzimat, the Arab revival movement, An-Nahda, which gradually prompted many Jews to write in literary Arabic, the Jewish Enlightenment movement, Ha'askala, the revival of Hebrew as a spoken language in Eretz Israel, and the rise of both Zionism and Arab national movements. In the 20th century, with the rise of Jewish and Arab national movements, both cultures saw a steady rise of the wish to purify the national language and national culture in order to reflect a homogeneous nation, be it Arab or Jewish. And this was perceived as part of modernization, to have a real language, not jargon, to have a real national language, purified language that is not mixed between languages. And this was also connected to Europeanization as secularization as modernization, in the sense that the influencing languages, for example, on Hebrew, should be European and not Arabic. Imagining a homogeneous nation, be it Arab or Jewish. Later on, the other, marked as the enemy, a tendency which culminated after 1948 in both Israel and parts of the Arab world. For example, Jewish writers in Iraq during the 30s and 40s who wrote in literary Arabic cleaned their language of distinctly Jewish elements in order to be neutral members of Iraqi literature and nation. Years later, writers from the Arab world arriving at Israel were asked to stop writing in Arabic, which was marked as foreign and exilic, or even primitive and hostile. Instead, they were expected to adopt Israeli Hebrew as their exclusive language. Furthermore, while writing in Hebrew, they were expected to clean their language by omitting any foreign Arabic elements, be it Judeo-Arabic, Muslim Arabic, literary Arabic, or even sometimes traditional Rabbinic Hebrew or Aramaic, signs for what was considered as adatiyut in literature. Some of the writers continued to write in literary Arabic in Israel. like Samir Naqash and Yitzhak Bar Moshe, or in Judeo-Arabic, like Rabbi David Buzaglo. Some gradually moved from Arabic to Hebrew, like Sami Michael and Shimon Balas, and some stopped writing or publishing altogether, feeling they are disconnected from their readership or due to economic situation after immigration. Thus, many writers from the Jewish communities of the Arab world, first-generation immigrants, and even more later generations, developed an ambivalent outlook toward their Arab Jewish cultural heritage, beginning with the colonial encounter and intensifying while in Israel. In the second half of the 20th century, as Judeo-Arabic gradually lost most of its speakers and became an endangered language, this severe cultural loss became itself a central experience for those writers, even those from second and third generation who no longer spoke their mother tongue. Looking at Arabic's place in Hebrew language writing by Jews of the Arab world in the 20th century and Hebrew's place in Arabic language texts during the same period, we can seek to explain how the relations between the two languages changed between the first half of the 20th century and the second half, between living in the Arab world and in Israel, and with changing attitudes towards religion, secularism, colonialism, nationalism, and so on. Works of authors who wrote in just one language differed in that regard from those who wrote in both languages. All those tell us about both modern Hebrew culture and modern Arab culture, and the boundaries between them and the complex relationship between the two as they have been manifested in the works of the Jews of the Arab world. It can also be compared with the bilingual situation of some of the Palestinian writers in Israel who wrote both in Arabic and in Hebrew. Going back to the beginning of the 19th century, the literary center in most Jewish communities of the Arab world, and even generally in the Muslim world, were centered around the two traditional languages. One is Lashon HaKodesh, the rabbinical Hebrew with Aramaic, that was the literary language that connected most Jewish communities in the world, and the local spoken Jewish language, be it Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Spanish, Judeo-Persian, Kurmanji, modern Aramaic, Amzir. Along the 19th century, especially from the second half of the 19th century, and also in the first half of the 20th century, the literature of the Jews of the Muslim world became very decentered, divided into different linguistic realms. The two traditional languages lost relatively some of their centrality, and other languages became competing ones. The languages of the majority culture that became later the national languages, be it modern Turkish, standard Persian, literary Arabic, modern Greek, and the colonial languages, as I said, and Israeli modern Hebrew. So the literary system was split into different literary systems. Jewish rabbinical literature being written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and the local Jewish language, local national literature being written in the majority's language, and also colonial literature and modern Hebrew literature. Those new literary systems, the national and colonial, defined themselves as modern and secular and westernized, and perceived a process of modernization and secularization to be part of it being Europeanization of literature in modern Arabic literature, like in modern Hebrew literature. It should be said that the Jews of the Islamic world were not one community, not even one literary community. We can think about them as different language communities, Maghrebi Arabic, Mashriqi Arabic, Yemenite Arabic, Judeo-Spanish, and so on, or different political structures or system, the Ottoman Empire, the French colonialism, the British colonialism, the new independent nation states, and so on. But part of the processes of those communities in questions of language, literature, and modernity, and of Jewish identity were parallel. Due to the influence of the Ottoman Empire reforms, the influence of European culture directly through colonialism or indirectly, and the rise of cultural Renaissance movements, and later on national movements, and the growing influence of Jewish nationalism, first in Eretz Israel, Palestine, and later with Zionist Arab conflicts also elsewhere. And by the middle of the 20th century, between 48 and 73, most of those communities were uprooted, partly in the Holocaust, the Jewish Greek community, some with the end of colonialism in Algiers, and others with the Zionist Arab conflict, first in Yemen and Iraq, later in Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia, and some gradually, like Morocco, Turkey. And most of the descendants of those communities came to Israel and other large parts to France and the US. We can see those processes exemplified in the Jewish press and through the project of Jewish Historical Press initiated by Professor Yaron Tzur, and also a survey that Professor Tzur did with Dr. Tamir Carcassonne about newspapers in the Muslim communities in the last 200 years. The first Jewish newspaper in the Islamic world was in Judeo-Spanish in 1840. And Judeo-Spanish became a central language in the press from that time until the 1980s, but continued to be part of this world of press until World War II. In the 1880s when I said earlier 1980s. In the 19th century, of course, I mean. And in the 50s, the first newspapers in Judeo-Arabic and Hebrew were established in the Muslim world. And Judeo-Arabic became central from the 80s of the 19th century until World War II. And Hebrew became central after World War I until the immigration. But of course, Jews read and published also Hebrew Ashkenazi newspapers at the same time. In 1870, first newspaper was published in Turkish, and Turkish became central after World War I to this day. The first Jewish newspaper in literary Arabic was published in the 70s of the 19th century, and it continued to be central again until immigration. A first newspaper in French was established in the 80s of the 19th century. And from the 90s, it became the most central language in Jewish press in the Muslim world. From 561 newspapers that were published in this period, 156 were in France, after it 90 in Judeo-Arabic, 69 in Judeo-Spanish, 51 in literary Arabic, 43 in Hebrew, 23 in Turkish, 17 in English, and 9 in Italian. We can see through the picture that the newspapers and the changing languages that were central in the Jewish press, the story that it tells us, story about difference between Jewish communities. Some of the communities, the center of their press was Jewish press, but in other communities, Jews participated more largely in the general press and not Jewish press, in French in Algiers, in literary Arabic in Iraq, and also other communities. In those projects of modernization in the new press, was there a place for rabbinical Jewish culture, for example, for traditional Jewish literature like piyut, liturgical poetry, or Sephardic poetry, neoclassical Sephardic poetry? It is very clear that the linguistic choices of those newspapers were also choices about the affinities to specific literary traditions. And in newspapers in French, in English, but also in Turkish and literary Arabic, it was rare to find a connection to those Jewish traditional literature. While in Hebrew literature, there was a central place for them, but also in the Jewish languages, in Judeo-Spanish and Judeo-Arabic, that were modernized through the press. There were translations of traditional literature, be it translations of liturgical poetry and translations of Sephardic poetry. At the same time that collections were anthologized in Hebrew for those literary traditions. The different choices of Jewish writers in the Muslim world in their languages of writing between the traditional languages, the colonial and the national languages, point to the gradual changes that came to be through the 19th century into the 20th century. So if in the beginning of the 19th century, as I said, the center was around the two traditional languages, in the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, there was a large change in entrance of colonial languages and national languages. The use of the traditional languages in this period can seem to us today as reflecting contradicting trends, but I think that's in a way an anachronistic outlook from today. Judeo-Arabic in the newspapers in Tunisia, in Morocco, also in the Iraqi diaspora in Iraq, was a tool for modernization. And of course, the language itself was modernized through its use in the newspapers for translation and so on. It was in contact with both the Arabic Nahda and with Hebrew Haskalah. And newspapers in Hebrew were connecting between rabbinical Hebrew, the Haskalah movement, and later on the national movement. In the second half of the 20th century, with the immigration of the majority of the Jews from the Islamic world and a majority arriving at Israel and adopting modern Israeli Hebrew as a spoken and written language, we can see a gradual detachment from Arabic, both Judeo-Arabic and literary Arabic, and from Judeo-Spanish. The different lingual choices also exemplify the differences between different communities. Literary Arabic was adopted in Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and predominantly in Iraq. Judeo-Arabic is a language of modernization in Tunisia and Morocco, and the Iraqi diaspora. French in North Africa, including Egypt, most radically in Algeria, of course, and a movement from Judeo-Spanish to Turkish with the establishment of modern Turkey by Ataturk. Those choices exemplify also different parts of the communities. Between the rabbinical elite that continued to use traditional languages with the use of the Jewish language transformed with immigration, and earlier some use of the majority language or colonial language, the middle class in the big cities that adopted in an early stage in the first half of the 20th century, the colonial languages in schools in many parts of North Africa and the Middle East, while in Iraq, the middle class adopted literary Arabic. And Jews of lower classes or outside the big cities continuing the traditional languages continued to be central for them. This map of changes moving between languages is connected to class, to religiosity, urbanization, and also ideology, Jewish rabbinical identities being expressed through the Jewish languages, pro-colonial identities through colonial languages, and national identities through the national languages. But the choice of languages is not always as unequivocal as it seems from afar because of so many transitions and connections between the languages, as almost all writers we can think of knew more than one language, moved between languages through life, between a mother tongue and a written language, through immigration, changing their writing language or writing bilingually or by translation, or writer who spoke one language and wrote in another. So those are not trivial or neutral choices of language, and those transitions appeared also in the writing, with signs to the older language in the new one. In that sense, many rabbinical Hebrew writers of rabbinical Hebrew met with Haskalah and modern Israeli Hebrew in their writing and in their writing community, a meeting place between rabbinical views and Zionist ideology. In Judeo-Arabic, a meeting place between rabbinical perspectives and projects of modernizations that and sometimes also reflecting negotiations with the Hebrew Haskalah and the literary Arabic Nahda. And writers in literary Arabic in the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, choosing to write in literary Arabic was a sign of affiliation with the Nahda movement, the renaissance of Arab culture, and later on it was a sign in many ways of identification with Arab nationalism, mostly local. After immigration to Israel, using literary Arabic could be sometimes a criticism of Zionism and Zionist monolingualism, but in many other times it was done through newspapers owned by Israeli establishment. And some writers later on showed a critical point of view of all national projects that forgot the Arab Jews. And the colonial languages in which in early stages there was an identification at least with the colonial culture or with the idea of westernization and secularization, but later on some of the most anti-colonial texts were of course written in the colonial languages, like the case of Albert Memmi. Languages determined as well the genres in which writers will write, and the literary traditions that were part of the discussion for those writers. So Hebrew and Jewish languages brought those literary traditions, but we will find in Edmond Jabès writing in French, but connecting to rabbinical traditions. Samir Naqash writing in literary Arabic, but then entering into it Judeo-Arabic and creating a unique meeting point between his place as a modern writer in Arabic, accepting Islamic Arabic tradition as his own, and also accepting Judeo-Arabic tradition and creating a new synthesis between them. It should be said that the detachment in research in the Israeli academia, but not only there, between the literature of Jewish communities in the East and Eastern literature, Mizrahi literature in Israel, is connected to the general historiographic detachment between New Hebrew literature that was defined as monolingual, national, one that passed the process of modernization, Europeanization, and secularization, and that is connected to the national time and the literature of the Middle Ages being different from it, rabbinical literature being different from it, and generally the literature of Jews of the Muslim world that was considered non-secular and continuing the Middle Ages. And if it was written in Judeo-Arabic, it was considered as jargon, not a real language. So it was considered also folklore, not a real literature that did not go through a process of modernization. Rabbinical Hebrew was perceived as a rabbinical culture that is not modern, as being part of religion and not of literature. And with the literature created in literary Arabic, due to perceiving generally Arab culture as backwards through Orientalistic colonial point of view, it was seen as not part of modern Jewish culture. In that sense, all parts of the literature of the Jews of the Arab world that was not written in colonial languages was perceived as pre-modern, as anachronistic, writing liturgical poetry in the 20th century, written outside of time or outside of history. And what was written in colonial languages was sometimes perceived as imitation, as not expressing an authentic Jewish experience. This perspective of academic research along the last 100 years and literary critics influence also the literature itself. What kind of literature would someone want to create once he's born in Israel as an ancestor to those traditions? Would he consider to be part of this literary tradition of piyut, or try to be part of modern Hebrew literature? In this stage, we could stop and ask, what is modernization? What is the modernity we talk about? A situation or a process? Does all those kinds of modernizations have to go through colonialism and nationalism, through the idea of national language in contrast with jargon or standard language, purified, leading to a monolingual situation, and not the bilingual situation that was predominant in Jewish diaspora, especially with writers? Is this modernity connected again and again to secularization, to Europeanization, and to having a state, like the known saying in Yiddish that a language is a jargon with an army and a navy? Do you need a state or an army to be modern? Or is it connected to other aspects of modernity, like economics, technology, ways of thought, systems, immigration? I don't think we can answer all those questions today, but we can start and talk about different modernities and talk about the aspect that were thought as part of the aspects that were thought as part of modernity and were very much talked about but proved to be paradoxical, like understanding only secular modernity as modernity, understanding secularization as a situation and not as ambivalent process. So we can talk about modernizations of languages, of literatures, of cultures, and in relation to the age of colonialism and nationalism, with the moments of both partition as a critical moments in modernity for Jews in the Muslim world, and also in other situations like between Greece and Turkey, India and Pakistan, and many other examples, and immigration, and ideas of return, of revival, of renaissance, even if we look at it in Hebrew, many times it was understood as contradicting Masoret ve'moderna, tradition and modernity. but we can see how heritage, tradition is a part of modernity and of modernization, going forward, but also going back. And it's a question of where do you go back to? So I will go now into one example, I think time will allow, with the ambivalence and connection between modernity and heritage, in a way, a heritage of modernity, or the idea of a tradition of modernity, through Avraham Shalom Yehuda. And I will discuss the return of Avraham Shalom Yehuda, who was born at 1877 in Jerusalem, to the figure and image of Rabbi Sa'adia Gaon, who was born at 882 in Egypt, that Yuval Ivri and myself went into this case in an article called From Sa'adia Gaon to Yehuda, Reviving Judeo-Arabic Intellectual Models in a Time of Partitions. And Sa'adia Gaon played a dominant role in the intellectual project of Avraham Shalom Yehuda generally. Sa'adia Gaon was not only a research object or historical figure to Yehuda, but also served as a symbol of an intellectual model that Yehuda aspired to revive in the modern Jewish context. In particular, Yehuda was interested in Sa'adia's linguistic transformative project, as well as in the connections and disputes with the Muslim and Karaite scholars of his time. Yehuda regarded himself as an academic scholar who engaged Orientalist scientific methods, as well as a Sephardi intellectual, or Chacham. These actions situated him within a long and rich intellectual heritage that dated back to medieval Al-Andalus and the Arab East, Al-Mashriq, and thus also to Sa'adia's heritage. Sephardic heritage of modernization, in a way, Sa'adia's project as in the 10th century, as modernization of Judaism in the 10th century through contemporary Arabic culture, as a model for 20th century Jewish modernization. Reconnecting Judaism to Judeo-Muslim traditions was, for Yehuda, a crucial step in modernization of Jewish culture, and a revival of Hebrew language and of Jewish life in Eretz Israel, Palestine. By analyzing Yehuda's return to Sa'adia Gaon, we can position Arab Jewish thought at the center of scholarly discourse on modern Jewish thought and the history of Eretz Israel, Palestine. It should be added that Yehuda also returned to pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, translating and writing about it as early as late 19th century, as a source for reconnecting new Hebrew culture with the East. Yehuda furthermore wrote about Arab Jewish writers in pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, and he believed that Arabic literature is necessary for understanding the literature of the Jews of the Arab world, who wrote in Hebrew, Judeo-Arabic, and literary Arabic. As such, Arabic language itself was a tool for him for interpreting biblical Hebrew, as well as for renewing modern Hebrew. At the core of his intellectual and political agenda, Yehuda emphasized the deep connections between Jewish and Muslim traditions. Although Sa'adia's influence is already evident in early works of Yehuda, the articles he specifically wrote about Sa'adia were published in 1942 at the American Hebrew Journal of Bitzaron. In this context, a strong personal dimension emerges. While Yehuda discussed Sa'adia's approach toward Arabic language, thought, and sciences, and their role in shaping the new Jewish and Hebrew thought at the turn of the 10th century, we can also read his views on the role of Arabic culture and Islamic thought as extending to modernization process of Hebrew and Jewish culture in the 20th century. In his first article about Sa'adia, Yehuda describes Sa'adia's approach to Arabic thought in those words. I will read first the Hebrew and then the translation. ואומנם השפעת רס"ג על בני דורו והבאים אחריו לא הייתה רק בדברי הלכה ודרישת התורה, אלא גם מצד ההשכלה הכללית של הערבים, להשתמש במדעיהם ודרכיהם ולהרחיב אופקי ידיעותיהם כדי לבסס את מדעי היהדות על יסודות חדשים. הוא פתח את השערים להכניס את המעולה ואת הטוב ואת הישר שבהשכלה הערבית לתוך לימודי היהדות, ולשכלל אותם במזיגה יפה ונכונה, בכיוון להתפתחות החוכמות בתקופה ההיא, וגם לפי רוח היהדות ולפי טעם שפתנו ומסורתנו. And in translation, indeed, the influence of Rabbi Sa'adia Gaon on his generation and those who followed wasn't limited only to his works on the halakha, Jewish law, and the Torah, but also includes his approach to the general haskalah, enlightenment of the Arabs, and how to use their sciences and methods and expand the horizons of their knowledge in order to establish the sciences of Judaism on new foundations. He opened the gates to introduce the excellent, the good, and the right of Arab enlightenment into the study of Judaism, according to the spirit of Judaism and the flavor of our language and traditions. In this passage, Yehuda uses modern terminology, the science of Judaism, Madei Yadut, and Haskalah, to describe Sa'adia's medieval project. This terminology refers to the two main Jewish modernization projects which Yehuda was influenced by and involved in the turn of the 20th century. In so doing, Yehuda implies that the first modernization and reformation of historical Judaism actually occurred in the 10th century with Arab Muslim civilization, while the second modernization of Judaism from the 18th to the 20th century should not be associated only with European Christian civilization, but must also connect itself anew to Arab Muslim tradition, especially in the case of the culture created in Eretz Israel, Palestine. Familiar with the emerging fascination in Ashkenazi European scholarly circles towards the work and figure of Sa'adia, Yehuda used the model of Sa'adia as a justification for his own scientific and political vision. Furthermore, he directly criticized the sciences of Judaism circles of his time and their biased attitudes towards Arabic. Even though Arabic and its larger cultural milieu was central to the development of Jewish thought, most of the Ashkenazi scholars, I quote, are satisfied with understanding them, these books, by using the Hebrew translations, which in themselves are influenced by the Arabic language and cannot be fully comprehended without knowledge of Arabic. An analogy is formed between Sa'adia and Yehuda. In Yehuda's article, Yehuda positions Sa'adia as a Jewish thinker who was strongly engaged in Arab and Muslim culture, yet was not motivated by the desire to assimilate, but rather to enrich Jewish culture. This importance of Arabic and Islamic influences on Jewish medieval thinkers and writers is emphasized through the works of Yehuda. For example, in one of his early articles, written while he was still studying in Germany, he explores the Arabic poetry written by Jews in Al-Andalus and articulates his criticism of the trends of Jewish scientific discourse to concentrate on the Hebrew poetry of the Andalusian phase, not reading the Arabic poetry of the time. It appears that Yehuda's fierce and clear objection to the separation of Arabic from Hebrew, of Judaism and Islam, of Jews and Palestinians in Eretz Israel, Palestine, represented something greater than a scientific or political dispute, as did his objection to the project of connecting Hebrew exclusively to the European culture, imagining a Judeo-Christian civilization, particularly in a way removed from the Judeo-Islamic civilization as he understood it. This polemic was connected to the essence of the question of Jewish identity and its social formation, as well as the living connection between Jews and Arabs in Eretz Israel, Palestine, and elsewhere, including in Yehuda's own intellectual world and lived history. Yehuda identified the dangers of partition between Jews and Arabs from its early stages and tried to prevent it. One last paragraph, not sentence, but paragraph. Yehuda's re-engagement with Sa'adia Gaon was part of a larger intellectual phenomena that we can go to, of return to medieval Arab Jewish and Andalusian thought in the Sephardi Arab Jewish intellectual circles of his generation, a fascination shared by many of his Sephardi contemporaries like Shaul Abdallah Yosef, returning to the Hebrew Andalusian poetry, especially to Moshe ibn Ezra, David Yalin, returning in the same way, Yosef Meyuchas returning to oral Islamic traditions of biblical prophets, Ariel Ben Zion and his literary project, and Yehuda Burla returning to Rabbi Judah Halevi. Those intellectuals were part of a growing circles of Sephardi scholars who were engaged in a variety of intellectual activities: literature, translation, the press, literary interpretation, philology, ethnographic research, education. Those scholars perceived their time as an Andalusian moment, a Sephardi moment, in which the heirs and successors of the great Andalusian poets, philosophers, and translators would re-establish the Judeo-Arabic tradition by reintegrating the fragmented history of the Arab Jewish scholarly world into modern Jewish culture. In this process, Andalus Sepharad and Judeo-Muslim tradition more generally served as a political and cultural models for a shared Arab-Jewish future in Eretz Israel, Palestine. I will stop here and we can expand in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Almog, for this
Thank you, Almog.
Rich and fascinating historical review of the linguistic turn in the and maybe linguistic map of the Sephardic world at the turn of the 20th century. There's lots of things that you open for us. I think it's a great setting for the whole of the series itself, and I think it will be connected to other lectures in the other meetings. We have a half an hour for discussion, so I already open it if you want to ask questions, to say something, to have share your thoughts. Please write us in the chat, and we'll give you the opportunity. I have already a few thoughts and maybe a question. I think that in the review that you open here in the turn of the 19th century, we can see two contradictory trends. First, just the trend that the linguistic expansion through colonialization, through immigration, through modernity. So people are more exposed to languages. So French is becoming very important in the Sephardic world, and English in certain parts, and sometimes German and Spanish, of course, alongside reviving of languages of Arabic and Judeo-Arabic and Judeo-Spanish through this press, as you show, and of course Hebrew is becoming, modern Hebrew is becoming very important. But in the same time, and maybe even the same moments, we see a trend that is an opposite trend to of demise of languages, of separation between languages, of impossibility of being multilingual as you've been before. And I think that part of what you showed us is first that modernity didn't came from outside. You know, part of common perception in the Jewish historiography is that modernity came to the Sephardic world from outside, to the French influence or the Spanish influence or the English influence, depends on the places. But what you showed us is, first of all, that in the Ottoman sphere, for instance, it was a very dynamic, polyglottic, multilingual, and already had modernization process in itself. And of course, in the North African context, as you said, in the 19th century, even before the French influence or beside the French influence and the Iraqi diaspora. So we have a picture of local processes of modernization. We have expansion of linguistic with colonialism and immigration and modernity. And we have this separation and partition that separate between traditions and linguistic and languages. And of course, nationality is the factor. And of course, most of the Sephardic world is now in Israel, and they're becoming monolingual is very important. And of course, and into this kind of conflicting trends, we have, of course, the disciplinary perspective, or the academic perspective that already starting to read this kind of processes from a monolingual or mononational or mono-regional perspective, and in a very reductive way. So this is, I would be really fascinated to see if you have something to say or elaborate about this kind of context maybe in your own work, a specific work. And if you can, again, maybe say something, elaborate, it was very fascinating, the ending of the returns. Because in the same way, when we talk about modernity, sometimes we are tending to think that modernity is going forward, it's not going backward. And in a way, returns are very important notion in modernity, not only in Sephardic modernity. Any modern projects, there is competing maybe projects of return. So if you can talk about it as well. And I already see that there is, there is other questions that coming up, but you can start here. And if there is people that wants to ask questions, please feel free to write. So Almog.
Thank you. Yeah, so I will try, but you know, your answer was as wide as a book is needed. I will try to start from a chapter or an abstract. So first, yes, like something was like two contradicting or ambivalent trends of linguistic affluence, and at the same time an ideal of monolingualism. And why it happened at the same time, I think we can see it through two different perspectives, maybe. Like one is this process of more and more languages being part of the lives of people in Istanbul and in Cairo and so on, was one process. But at the same time, in a way, like there is an interesting quotation of David Ben Gurion after he goes to study law at Istanbul and Saloniki. He stays there for a while and returns, and he speaks very fearfully about the linguistic situation. Like, you go there, you need to know Turkish for your studies, Judeo-Spanish for the family you are living with, Greek for the street, French for the newspaper. And I have already like the 3 languages that I came with, and I need to study Hebrew, right? So with this situation of multilingualism, you have many people that are afraid of this situation, because in a way, it turns off, like part of it comes from new boundaries, but some of it are also boundaries that are being shifted aside and that are viewed as a risk for the Jewish community, for Jewish continuity, and so on. So you have this, like it's not a coincidence that it happened at the same time, like the processes, you know, of emancipation in Europe earlier, and that raising the fear of the disappearance of the Jewish community and having like a national answer to it or a ultra-Orthodox answer to it. So also those linguistic situations are ones of opportunities, but those were created also sometimes by violence, by occupation, and a new language that comes with the occupier. So it's ambivalent from the first. But your view as to what is a normal life, right? Like how many languages should your child live with? That was something that was very confusing to many people, and they tried to answer it. And some of them, right, with limiting the number of languages that your children will need. Like for yourself, it's too late, of course, but it's always projects to the future. By the way, it's also connected to the fact that this is a period of time with colonialism and nationalism, that there is a strong belief in large scale human and social engineering. Like those people really believe that they can eliminate languages from the world and that they recreate languages. And we live now with those projects, with what died, but what remained in the process, and what was created and is modern Hebrew not a jargon, or is it a jargon, and so on. So in those views about what is a language, what is jargon, are also connected to very modernistic points of view, like in a school, right, which is like with national projects from France in the 19th century, like making the entire state learn the French of Paris and not a provincial language, and so on. So those projects were there already, understanding, you know, that there is something authentic or something about certain languages that you need to preserve and to eliminate others, which is, it's not a coincidence, by the way, that the idea of family of languages is connected to the idea of family of races, and to the idea of pure races and non-pure races. So some people didn't think of it as a symbol, but as something to recreate in the present. So you had another question, but maybe
Yeah,
I'll
but
wait.
there is many questions here in the chat.
Yeah, we have many. Should we start from? Yeah, let's try to read them all. For example, we start with the first one from Ziad El Marsafi. He says, thanks, brilliant paper and series. I'm curious about the definitions of modernity at work in the Mizrahi Sephardi cultural space. Almog spoke eloquently about the process of secularization, but were there others, for example, economic progress, the making rational of the real, etc.?
Okay. Yeah. So I'll write.
Maybe we'll take all the questions together
You
to
think
allow
so?
time. Yeah, because I think
Okay.
we have.
Yeah, you're right. You're okay.
If you're okay with it, Almog.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you okay with that? Okay,
I
great.
will write to myself on a paper.
Okay.
So I won't forget.
So Lea Shakdiel says, I would like to know if the processes described are different from the processes that happened in the Yiddish Ashkenazi world, and in what ways? Thank you. That's Lea Shakdiel. Yakov Yadgar asks, he says, thank you, Almog. Do you see a possibility of resistance to, or even amending the wrongs of monological nationalism in a return to multilingualism? Or is this but a futile cultural exercise in the face of the brutality of that which holds as a matter of fact those army and the navy? And Arya Duvnov says an outstanding talk and survey, and I loved the paraphrase on Max Weinrich, a language is a dialect with an army and navy. Shifting in gears from production of leaders to consumption, I am curious to hear Professor Behar's thought about to audience and those who consumed this literature. Do we see a rise or decline of communities of readers in a different market that explains some of these changes alongside colonialism, immigration, and nationalism? Is modern capitalist logic not pushing toward monolingualism? Yakov Ravkin, Jewish communities such as Salonika lived naturally in a multilingual environment. Ben-Gurion was a newcomer imbued with nationalism and the national language. I wonder if Salonika Jews were concerned about their future in early 20th century. Moise Ben-Arosh asks, where do you draw the line between modernization and colonization?
Okay.
And can I add my own question?
Sure.
Privileged
organizers.
I was wondering, what do you exactly mean by understanding secularization, either as an ambivalent process or a situation? It's a very specific question. If you can clarify that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so like two questions went to ask about the market or about economy, right? The one of Arya Duvnov and the first question of Ziad, and I'm not sure I can answer all of it. About Ziad's question about the modernity that it is expressed not through literature or culture or language, but through economical changes. I'm sure there are, but there are people, there are better people for me to answer that question. And what Arya asked, which is a good question, does capitalism is like a reason for monolingualism, right? And today it would be easy to see that through the expansion of English. But I'm not sure that at the time that we are talking about, the reason for the expansion of modern Hebrew in Eretz Israel, Palestine, was that capitalism. So I'm not sure, and also like the changes, but yes, there is a big influence, of course. Like if press becomes a major issue, and so of course you need an audience, and of course the kinds of audience that you expect influence the kind of literature you can write or publish or translate. So that is very clear. Yes, I'm not sure. In some things it's hard to measure today, like how many readers were to specific newspapers, to specific books, but some of them we know. So so it's something also I have to think about more. Going to Leah Shakdiel's question about what happened regarding Yiddish and Ashkenazi communities. So some of it is, of course, parallel in the sense of traditional languages being at the center, Hebrew and the spoken Jewish language, and them being set aside. The kind of colonial process is different. Like we call that some of it like through the empires, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We can ask it through emancipation, and like how could Jews enter the new national community in places where emancipation, France, Germany. So the change was like, it is clear that French had some alliance, of course, when it was founded. It had also schools in Romania, not only in the Balkan and the Middle East and North Africa. And French culture was influencing at the same time in Russia, in the general public, not only Jewish. So there are many connections. Of course, when we move to immigration and to what happened in Israel-Palestine, I think that some of the changes, some of the differences, like it's clear that at the time, like again, quoting Ben Gurion, I didn't mean to quote him so much, but he's a good example for some of those problems. But when he was hearing a testimony in the 42 or something like that about what is happening in the concentration camps, and of course the one who was talking about it talked in her mother tongue, which was coincidentally also his mother tongue. And when she ended, he stood up and said, "Shamanu safa zara vetzoremet, zara vetzoremet." We just heard a language that is foreign and that is, tzoremet, not good to the ear, but maybe a more specific translation to it. Disharmonical. But anyways, like the first word that he used was foreign, and that was his mother tongue. Right? So was he serious, or was it a performance? And it's in a way like already physical, like you feel in a way that it's an ugly language, like it's something, that, so.
Is it appropriate to respond like that to a woman giving testimony about the concentration camps?
Yeah, exactly. Like if that's the first problem that you have with what you heard, that she wasn't educated enough in Hebrew or didn't have the time and couldn't give the testimony in Hebrew, but in Yiddish, right? So it is clear that in the first half of the 20th century, like the hatred towards Yiddish in Zionism in Israel was more central than this approach towards Arabic. In the second half of the 20th century, it's a certain point, it shifts, right? And still in the 50s and 60s, Yiddish is at that place, and Arabic and German are also a problem. Like those are the three most problematic languages at the period for Zionism. But with Arabic, in a way, like the experience of those who spoke Arabic was that something was taken from them, right? And with Yiddish, the ethos, which is of course like about 5 people, but then it is told historically as if it's a history of a movement, they gave up Yiddish from a choice and replaced it with Arabic, in a sense, like it's a story of a suicide of Yiddish and of murder of Arabic. Now, of course, it's symbolic. In its history, it didn't happen as a suicide always at that case, and as a murder also always at that case. But in the historical memory, it is represented as such. And in that sense, it raises different emotions. I will try to answer Yaakov Yadgar's question, but that's a question about the future, right? So I can't answer it. Like Yaakov asked if it can be fixed, right? If what happened in the transition into mono-nationalism and monolingualism can be transformed, and does going back to bilingualism or trilingualism and so on can repair something from the national situation. So, you know, I'm not sure. And that's a question about the future. Like, I do think that, you know, if 1 million Jews in Israel studied Arabic in the coming year, something will change. But national movements tend to be able to absorb many things into themselves and call them just a new phase of something that they planned. So in one sense, I believe that culture and language can change very much, but I wouldn't sign for it or and say that in a very limited time frame, I can see how it changes, right? And two last questions of Moise about the difference between colonialism and modernization, and of Angie about secularism. So first, what is the difference between colonialism and secularization, right? That could also be asked in that sense. So I'm not sure. Like what can be said is that if we talk about different modernities and not only about one kind of modernity, and then we go and we see how modernist modernity in Turkey and earlier on in the Ottoman Empire was understood, and then like in Egypt how it was understood, and other countries, and then we can see different projects that were of course influenced by the European hegemony, and in Egypt by direct colonialism also, but that also created new projects. And from them, we can think also about Jewish modernity that went through all those processes, and then its process in Israel in a way made us forget the earlier processes, right? Like, I think that what limits the imagination about Mizrahi modernity in Israel is the fact that in the Israeli hegemonical imagination, those are non-modern people that came to Israel and Israel modernized them, right? And what is ambivalent about the story is when we go and we see what happened earlier in Morocco, what happened earlier in Algiers, and what it meant in Israel. Like if someone came and had already like the tools of what was considered modern, like modern Western European languages, like English and French, does it change his situation in the Israeli system? Is he considered modern or not? Like the use, for example, of the phrase Levantine exactly placed that in a sense, when people came with French or English or Spanish cultures, that was considered imitation or a even larger problem, right? Because we prefer authentic Jews from the Muslim world that never heard of English until they came to Israel than to have people who can compete with us, right? So again, it's ambivalent. And Angie, your question about secularization, like I think what I was pointing at was to the difference between a process and a situation. Like, do we understand, can we see a place in the world that is now in a situation of secularism? That the process ended and now a society is secular, or those people are secular, right? And I'm not sure. Like, I think that when we look at secularism as a situation, we create a problem for our ability to understand the historical processes and the literary reality, because many times what we have, like with monolingualism, is like a deep fantasy of being secular or of being monolingual, but in your head you have many other thoughts that compete with it, right? And that you don't have this tranquil moment that you understand, okay, you were secularized enough, right? By the way, it's also like processes of lechzor b'tshuva, of becoming religious, are also of that kind. Like, when are you religious enough, right? Is it a process or a moment?
Yeah.
So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sure there were other questions that didn't get to be asked, but at some point we unfortunately need to say goodbye. And this was amazing. Thank you, Almog, for your generosity and for such a rich lecture, and for your generous answers too. Thank you everybody who stayed until the very end. Thank you all. Yuval, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I just want to say that, first of all, thank you for everyone at Almog, and it was a great foundation for the series. And our next meeting is going to be in March 18th with Yaakov Yadgar from Oxford University, and he's going to talk about Sfaradim in Israel and critique of secularism. So it's we already touched it, this kind of question. So language is really a great foundation in that sense. So thank you very much. Thank you, Angie.
Thank you all. Thank you, Yuval. Thank you, Almog, and thank you, everybody. And we will see you all next month. Bye. Bye-bye.